In 1961, Will Durant published the 7th of 11 volumes on the story of civilization, The Age of Reason Begins. The political, social, and moral history of all European countries, along with the Islamic world of Turkey. It spans from the accession of Elizabeth I in 1558 and the birth of Shakespeare in 1564 to the death of Galileo in 1642 and Descartes in 1650. This era witnessed the decline of murderous theologies and the rise of murderous nationalisms. Will Durant writes, "This volume began as a simple wrap-up to my history of civilization. I had hoped to call it The Age of Reason and trace Europe's cultural development from Elizabeth I's ascension to the eruption of the French Revolution. However, as I neared our present time, the sheer number of influential personalities and events demanded more than a dry chronicle. They needed a human touch, and that, my dear listener, requires space. What was meant to be one book has ballooned into 5. I've studied every major religion in its native environment, read and reread major literary works, and explored every significant philosophical contribution. I'm obligated to uncover the fundamental processes shaping modern European culture. This obligation compels me to impartiality in presenting facts and personalities according to their influence. Each volume and chapter in this series can be listened to independently. You can sit back and watch the story unfold, or skip to the sections that resonate most with the events around you. The following is a comprehensive summary of the story of civilization, The Age of Reason Begins, highlighting its finest moments. Chapter 1. The Uses of Adversity. Elizabeth's early life was a crucible of hardship. Will Durant writes, "An Act of Parliament in 1536 declared her mother Anne's marriage null, making Elizabeth illegitimate. Coarse gossip debated the girl's paternity. In any case, to most Englishmen she was the daughter of adultery. Declared illegitimate by Parliament and witnessing the execution of her mother in her childhood left a lasting scar. These experiences instilled in her a profound caution and a determination to secure her position." Elizabethan government. Elizabeth was shrewd in her selection of advisors, choosing men of talent and loyalty, often from outside the ranks of the established nobility. William Cecil, her principal advisor, was a master of policy and detail, a steady hand in the turbulent waters of politics. He guided her in matters of finance, defense, and the delicate task of establishing Protestantism in England. Elizabeth herself, however, remained firmly in control, as evidenced by the Spanish ambassador's exasperated observation. "She gives her orders and has her way as absolutely as her father, the amorous virgin." Elizabeth's unmarried state, her carefully cultivated image of the Virgin Queen, was a masterstroke of diplomacy. It kept potential suitors dangling, fueled the rumor mills, and added a layer of fascination to her persona. Some alleged that her virginity was a consequence of physical impediment. The gossip of the court held that she had a membrane on her which made her incapable of man, though for her delight she tried many. A French surgeon undertook to cut it, yet fear stayed her. Whether a political tactic or a personal truth, it allowed her to use the promise of marriage as a bargaining chip in the game of international relations. Elizabeth and her court. Elizabeth's court was a reflection of her personality, vibrant, sophisticated, and steeped in the spirit of the Renaissance. It was a stage where the finest minds of the age, poets, playwrights, and scholars, gathered under her patronage. Her court was characterized by its love of ceremony and ideal of the gentleman, with men rivaling the women in molding Oriental stuffs to Italian styles. She knew how to use spectacle and display to project an image of power and majesty. Elizabeth and religion. Elizabeth inherited a kingdom split by religious conflict. Catholics and Protestants, their passions inflamed by decades of upheaval, struggled for dominance. She, a Protestant herself, sought to chart a middle course with the establishment of the Anglican Church, a compromise that retained elements of Catholic ritual while rejecting papal authority. Cecil, her advisor, had warned her that state could never be in safety where there was toleration of two religions. It was a delicate balancing act, with oscillating support for the two groups, Elizabeth and the Catholics. The Catholics, with their allegiance to the Pope, represented a challenge to Elizabeth's authority. The Pope's excommunication of Elizabeth in 1570, absolving her subjects from allegiance to her, was a declaration of war. Catholic missionaries, like the Jesuits Parsons and Campion, secretly entered England, stirring up discontent and seeking to restore the old faith. Faced with this threat, Elizabeth responded with a wave of persecution. Statutes were passed making it a capital crime to call the Queen a heretic, schismatic, usurper, or tyrant, or to introduce a papal bull into England, or to convert a Protestant to the Roman Church. It was a harsh response, but in Elizabeth's eyes, necessary to safeguard her throne and the stability of her kingdom. Elizabeth and the Puritans. While the Catholics posed an external threat, the Puritans, with their insistence on a more radical form of Protestantism, challenged Elizabeth from within her own church. They sought to purge the church of all vestiges of Catholic ritual and establish a theocracy ruled by a strict moral code. Elizabeth, who had no taste for theological extremism, saw them as a danger to her authority and the established order. She moved against them. Her archbishop demanded of all English clergymen an oath accepting the 39 Articles, the Prayer Book, and the Queen's religious supremacy. He subpoenaed all objectors before the High Commission Court, and there they were subjected to such detailed and insistent inquiry into their conduct and belief that it was compared to the procedure of the Spanish Inquisition. Elizabeth in Ireland. Ireland had been conquered by the English in the 12th century and had been held ever since on the grounds that otherwise it would be used by France or Spain as a base for attacks on England. Ireland was a story of tragedy and missed opportunities. The Irish, loyal to their Catholic faith and their ancient ways, fiercely resisted English rule. Elizabeth's attempts to impose Protestantism and extend English control over the island resulted in a series of bloody and costly rebellions. Massacres like those at Rathlin and Smerwick, the brutal displacement of Irish families to make way for English plantations, left a legacy of bitterness and hatred that would haunt Anglo-Irish relations for centuries. Irish rebels had sent their wives and children and their old and diseased to seek refuge and safety at the island of Rathlin. The English, eager to capture the island, killed every last one of them even though they had surrendered. Elizabeth and Spain. Elizabeth's dealings with Spain were a masterclass in politics. She kept the Spanish king, that most powerful of European monarchs, off balance for years, allowing him to dream of a marriage alliance while she secretly aided his enemies and encouraged English privateers to plunder Spanish treasure. When the inevitable war finally came, it was a clash of titans, a struggle for control of the seas and the future of Europe. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was a turning point in history, marking the decline of Spanish power and the rise of England as a global force. Raleigh and Essex. Raleigh and Essex embodied the spirit of Elizabethan England, its ambition, its energy, and its thirst for adventure and glory. Raleigh, the explorer, scholar, and poet, a man of intellect and ambition. Essex, the soldier, seeking glory on the battlefield and recognition at court. Their rivalry, fueled by ambition and the Queen's favor, poisoned the atmosphere at court, culminating in Essex's ill-fated rebellion and his execution. As Essex's servant Cuff lamented, he carried his love and hate always on his face and knew not how to hide them. It was a story of ambition unchecked, of loyalty strained to the breaking point, and a reminder that even in the most glorious of reigns, the shadows of human passion and the lure of power could lead to ruin. The magic fades. In her final years, the weight of her crown, the burden of her choices, began to take their toll on Elizabeth. The magic that had captivated her court and her people began to fade. She retreated into a world of melancholy and introspection, her once vibrant spirit dimmed by the loss of those she had loved and the growing discontent of her subjects. Yet even in decline, she retained her regal bearing. In her golden speech to Parliament in 1601, she reminded them of her devotion to her people, declaring, "There is no jewel, be it of never so rich a price, which I prefer before your love." Chapter 2. Merrie, England. Beyond the Queen and the court, what was life like for the average Elizabethan? At work. The economic landscape was shifting. While agriculture still employed the majority, the towns were expanding. The influx of skilled refugees from the continent, fleeing religious persecution, strengthened the English industry. Textile shops expanded as weavers and fullers fled to England from Alva's oppression in the Netherlands. Huguenots brought from France their artisan and mercantile skills, leading to a boom in textile production. The government, ever keen to manage the economy, introduced the Statute of Apprentices, a set of regulations designed to control wages, limit unemployment, and ensure a steady supply of skilled labor. This statute, however, often had the opposite effect of depressing wages and worsening the plight of the working poor, particularly as inflation soared. In the schools, education, while not yet a universal right, was undergoing its own transformation. The old grammar schools continued to provide a classical education for boys, supplemented by a healthy dose of flogging. The elite public schools like Eton and Winchester catered to the sons of the wealthy, preparing them for positions of authority in the church and state. Meanwhile, the ancient universities of Oxford and Cambridge, recovering from the religious upheaval of the previous decades, continued to be the primary centers of higher learning. As for women, their access to formal education remained limited. While daughters of the wealthy received private tutoring at home, all organized education of girls had been ended by Henry VIII's dissolution of the nunneries. Virtue and vice. The Elizabethan era was a time when old certainties were being challenged by new ideas. The Puritan minority, with their strict moral code and their suspicion of worldly pleasures, denounced the perceived laxity of their fellow countrymen. Philip Stubbs, a Puritan, described the Elizabethan English as wicked, vainly luxurious, and proud of their sins. But the prevailing mood, influenced by Renaissance humanism and the example of a vibrant court culture, was one of greater permissiveness. The themes of romantic love, the pursuit of beauty, and the enjoyment of life's pleasures found expression in the literature, music, and theater of the age. Justice and the law. The Inns of Court, training grounds for lawyers, churned out legal minds that would shape the course of English jurisprudence for centuries to come. Yet, despite its strengths, the legal system was riddled with corruption. Judges, beholden to the crown for their positions, were readily susceptible to bribery and political pressure. The criminal justice system was particularly harsh. Capital punishment was prescribed for an array of offenses, from theft to cutting down trees. Torture, although technically illegal, was routinely employed by the Star Chamber, an instrument of royal authority that operated largely outside the constraints of common law. In the home, life in Elizabethan England was fraught with peril. Infant mortality remained high. Epidemics like the plague swept through towns and villages regularly, leaving a trail of death and despair in their wake. Even the most basic amenities were often lacking. Private bathrooms were few. Most families used a wooden tub placed before an open fire. English art. The architect Inigo Jones, inspired by the classical ideals of Palladio, sought to introduce a pure form of Renaissance architecture into England, as shown in his design for the banqueting house at Whitehall. In this era, architecture became a powerful symbol of national pride, ambition, and the spirit of the age. Chapter 3. On the Slopes of Parnassus. The printing press had unleashed a torrent of books upon the land. Patronage, both royal and aristocratic, played a vital role in supporting authors, creating a symbiotic relationship between writers and the powerful. Public libraries were rare, but private libraries common amongst the wealthy. The Stationers' Company, while established to regulate the publishing industry and enforce censorship, unintentionally contributed to the growth of literature by creating a system of copyright, although one that primarily protected publishers, not authors. Chapter 4. William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare stands as a colossus in English literature. Despite the efforts of researchers, much about his life remains shrouded in mystery. Yet we know enough to piece together a portrait of this extraordinary man, from his humble beginnings in Stratford-upon-Avon to his career as an actor and playwright in London. Youth 1564 till 1585. Born in Stratford-upon-Avon to a middle-class family, he likely received a basic education at the local grammar school, acquiring small Latin and even less Greek. Local lore paints him as a mischievous youth stealing venison and rabbits. At the age of 18, he married Anne Hathaway, a woman 8 years his senior, in a union that seems to have been born of necessity rather than romance. The circumstances surrounding his departure for London a few years later remain unclear, leaving a gap in our knowledge of his formative years. Development, 1592 till 1595. Shakespeare's arrival in London marked the beginning of his meteoric rise in the theatrical world. He began as an actor, gradually working his way up the ranks from bit parts to leading roles. By 1594, he had become a shareholder in the Chamberlain's Men, a prominent acting company. Simultaneously, he honed his skills as a playwright, starting as a play doctor, revising and adapting existing scripts. His early plays, like The Comedy of Errors and Love's Labour's Lost, reveal a youthful exuberance and a penchant for light-hearted fare. However, with plays like Richard III, he began to display a growing mastery of dramatic structure and characterization, his language taking on a distinctive power and beauty. Mastery, 1595 to 1608. The years from 1595 to 1608 witnessed the flowering of Shakespeare's genius, a period in which he produced a string of masterpieces that have secured his place as the greatest dramatist in the English language. His plays, marked by their psychological depth and their profound insights into the human condition, are not mere historical dramas but timeless meditations on the nature of good and evil, fate and free will, love and loss. Artistry. Shakespeare's artistry lay in his unparalleled command of language, his ability to transform the mundane into the magical, and his understanding of human nature. His vocabulary was vast, encompassing the slang of the streets, the technical jargon of various professions, and the lyrical beauty of the English countryside. Philosophy. Shakespeare was not a philosopher in the traditional sense. He did not construct elaborate metaphysical systems or engage in abstract debates about the nature of reality. However, his plays are infused with a philosophical sensibility, reflecting his keen observations of human behavior and his meditations on the complexities of life. He recognized the relativity of morals, noting that there's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. He grappled with the problem of evil, portraying characters like Iago and Edmund as embodiments of pure malice. He explored the corrosive effects of power, showing how ambition can corrupt even the noblest of souls. And he offered no easy answers to the perennial questions of fate and free will. Shakespeare died in 1616. Chapter 5. Merrie, Queen of Scots. Merrie, Queen of Scots, a tragic figure. The story of Merrie, like a Shakespearean tragedy, was marked by extraordinary promise and devastating misfortune. The Fairy Queen. Mary Stuart, a figure of royal lineage, ascended to the Scottish throne as a mere infant. Her ancestry, interwoven with both Scottish and English bloodlines, made her a potent symbol of power and ambition. Her beauty and grace were legendary, captivating those who crossed her path. French courtiers marveled at the snow of her pure face and the gold of her curled and plaited hair, while L'Hôpital believed that such loveliness must be a reflection of divine favor. Her allure extended beyond physical charm. She was a woman of intellect and spirit, fluent in Latin, skilled in music, and possessing a talent for poetry. She embodied the ideal of a Renaissance princess, a blend of beauty, grace, and intelligence. Yet, beneath this shimmering facade lay a vulnerability that would ultimately prove her undoing. Scotland, 1560 to 1561. Merrie returned to Scotland, a land vastly different from the refined court of France where she had spent her youth. Scotland, a nation riven by religious and political tensions, presented a formidable challenge to the young queen. It was a society grappling with illiteracy, illegitimacy, and widespread violence, its people seeking solace in a fervent religious faith. The Reformation had swept through Scotland, leaving in its wake a Protestant movement led by John Knox. The Catholic Church was now in decline, its wealth coveted by ambitious nobles. England, wary of Scottish power, sought to manipulate these internal divisions to its advantage. Merrie, a devout Catholic, found herself at the helm of a nation increasingly embracing Protestantism, a situation fraught with peril. Merrie and Knox, 1561 to 1565. The clash between Merrie and John Knox epitomized the tumultuous religious landscape of Scotland. Knox viewed Mary's Catholicism as a threat to the spiritual well-being of the nation. He denounced her from the pulpit, condemning the Catholic Mass as more offense than 10,000 armed foes. Their historic confrontation at Holyrood Palace, in which Knox challenged the Queen's authority and condemned the Catholic Church as a Roman prostitute, highlighted the irreconcilable differences between their faiths. Merrie, despite her attempts at reconciliation, faced constant criticism from Knox and his followers, who viewed her as a symbol of idolatry and condemned the revelry and stinking pride of her court. The Queen in Love, 1565 to 1568. Mary's tumultuous personal life further complicated her already precarious position. Her marriage to the young Lord Darnley proved to be a disastrous miscalculation. Initially smitten by his charm and good looks, Merrie soon discovered his shallowness and lack of judgment. When Merrie became pregnant, her husband Lord Darnley became jealous of her close relationship with David Richelieu, her Italian secretary and confidant. Darnley suspected the child might be Richelieu's rather than his own. Darnley entered the boudoir where Merrie, Richelieu, and Lady Argyle were at supper. He grasped and held the Queen. His men rushed in, dragged Richelieu from the room, and stabbed him to death on the stairs. 50 wounds for good measure and sure. In the aftermath, Merrie turned to James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, for solace and protection. Bothwell, a powerful and charismatic figure, captivated Merrie with his strength and decisiveness. Their relationship, however, quickly became a source of scandal and controversy. Later, Merrie gave birth to a son, and Lord Darnley died of disease. Accusations of adultery and complicity in Darnley's murder swirled around the Queen, fueled by the discovery of the infamous casket letters, a collection of incriminating correspondence allegedly linking Merrie to Bothwell and implicating her in Darnley's death. Whether genuine or forged, these letters cast a dark cloud over Merrie's reputation, eroding public support and emboldening her enemies. Expiation 1568 to 1587. The final chapter of Merrie's life unfolded as a tale of imprisonment, intrigue, and ultimately execution. Following Darnley's death and her marriage to Bothwell, Merrie faced open rebellion from the Scottish nobles. Forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI, she fled to England seeking the protection of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. This act of desperation proved to be a fatal error. Elizabeth, afraid of Merrie's claim to the English throne and her potential as a rallying point for Catholic dissent, placed her under house arrest. Merrie's 19-year captivity, with a series of plots and conspiracies to free her and restore her to power, transformed her into a symbol of Catholic resistance against the Protestant ascendancy. The Babington Plot of 1586, in which Merrie was implicated in a scheme to assassinate Elizabeth, sealed her fate. Condemned by an English court, she met her end on the executioner's block in 1587. Chapter 6, James VI and 1. James VI of Scotland. Born into a world of political intrigue and violence, he was crowned King of Scotland at the age of 13 months, while his mother, Merrie Queen of Scots, was held captive. Growing up amidst feuding lords, young James had to learn to navigate these waters with cunning and intelligence. He was described as the most learned hard drinker in Europe. James, though raised Protestant, cautiously maintained correspondence with Catholic powers. However, his reign was a constant struggle with the Scottish Church, a powerful and democratic institution which sought to exert its Protestant control over both public and private life. This clash of ideologies, the divine right of kings versus the democratic power of the Church, came to a head when a preacher boldly declared to James, "In Scotland, there is Christ Jesus in his kingdom the Church, whose subject King James VI is not a king, nor a head, nor a lord, but a member." Another minister told his congregation that all kings were children of the devil, that Elizabeth was an atheist, and James was Satan himself. James I of England. Upon the death of Elizabeth I, James ascended to the English throne, uniting the two nations under a single monarch. For Scotland he was James VI, for England and Ireland he was James I. He was, by then, a man of contradictions, vain and generous, timorous and deceitful, ready to take and give offense, to grant and sue for pardon. Despite his love of extravagance and fondness for courtly amusements, James was no fool. He was a passionate bibliophile, a patron of the arts, and possessed a keen intellect. His belief in the divine right of kings, however, would set the stage for future conflicts with the English Parliament, the Gunpowder Plot. James's reign involved religious tensions, with both Puritans and Catholics vying for influence. James's attempts to reconcile the two groups largely failed, and the resentment felt by some Catholics led to the infamous Gunpowder Plot of 1605. The plot aimed to blow up Parliament and the king. They got a house near to the palace. 16 hours a day they labored to dig a tunnel and place 30 barrels of gunpowder directly under the meeting chamber of the House of Lords. One of the conspirators warned his friends several days before the session was to begin. News reached the king and the plan was foiled. The event led to increased persecution of Catholics and the enforcement of stricter laws against them. Several priests were hanged, and one Catholic missionary was put to death after having his legs crushed and being kept awake for 8 consecutive days and nights by the insertion of pins into his flesh. According to Will Durant, all the sins of the old church were visited upon her by the new certainties and powers. James sows the whirlwind. James's later years involved a growing rift between the crown and Parliament. His attempts to secure a marriage alliance with Spain for his son Charles were met with resistance from both Parliament and the English people. The execution of Sir Walter Raleigh, a controversial figure who had fallen from favor, further fueled popular resentment. James's insistence on peace was challenged by the rise of mercantile interests eager for colonial expansion and war with Spain. Over time, James had poisoned his organs with indiscriminate food and drink. In his final years, he suffered from catarrh, arthritis, gout, stone, jaundice, diarrhea, and hemorrhoids. He bled every day and refused medicine. He died in 1625, murmuring the last consolations of his faith. During his reign, the seeds of conflict had been sown, setting the stage for the tumultuous reign of his son, Charles I. Chapter 7. The Summons of Reason. Under James I, the intellectual landscape largely indulged in superstition, hindering the advancement of true knowledge. Superstition. Belief in witchcraft was rampant, fueled by fear and ignorance, with thousands falling victim to accusations and persecution. James himself was a firm believer in witchcraft, even writing a treatise on demonology. Will Durant notes, nearly all occultisms flourished among the Britons under Elizabeth and the early Stuarts. The horrific extent of this persecution is exemplified in the case of Scotland where, between 1560 and 1600, approximately 8,000 women were burned as witches, a staggering number for a nation of barely 1 million souls. Science. Despite the grip of superstition, the practical demands of a growing economy and an expanding world led to the development of science. The rise of commerce and industry demanded new tools and technologies, leading to inventions like logarithms, the microscope, and the telescope, as well as advancements in mathematics, navigation, and astronomy. The rise and fall of Francis Bacon. Amidst this environment emerged the figure of Francis Bacon. Bacon's political career was a relentless pursuit of power and ultimately culminated in his downfall due to charges of corruption. This stands in stark contrast to his intellectual achievements. The Great Renewal. In his work, the Instauratio Magna, The Great Renewal, Bacon laid out a vision for the future of science and philosophy, advocating for a systematic approach to the pursuit of knowledge. Recognizing the limitations of traditional methods, Bacon boldly declared, "There was but one course left, to try the whole thing anew upon a better plan, and to commence a total reconstruction of sciences and all human knowledge, raised upon the proper foundation." This call for a new approach to knowledge, based on observation, experimentation, and inductive reasoning, signaled a shift away from blind adherence to ancient authorities, a statesman's philosophy. Bacon's philosophy, though lacking a systematic structure, offered reflections on the nature of knowledge, power, and morality. He believed, man, being the servant and interpreter of nature, can do and understand so much and so much only as he had observed, in fact or in thought, of the course of nature. Beyond this he neither knows anything nor can do anything. Human knowledge and human power meet in one, For where the course is not known, the effect cannot be produced. Nature, to be commanded, must be obeyed. This emphasis on the practical application of knowledge, the ability to control nature through understanding, foreshadows the coming Industrial Revolution. Chapter 8: The Great Rebellion. The coming English Civil War was not just a political struggle or a battle of wills between leaders. It was the climax of economic changes, religious upheavals, and ideological conflicts that had simmered for decades. A nation once united under the rule of Elizabeth I was now splintering into factions, leading to the unthinkable, the execution of a king. A changing economy. The feudal order, with its foundation in land ownership and aristocratic privilege, was crumbling. Rising in its place was a mercantile economy, powered by wealth that flowed not from the soil but through trade, manufacturing, and finance. The gentry, landowners without titles, and the wealthy bourgeoisie, bankers, merchants, and industrialists, were gaining influence. They wanted a voice in government that matched their economic clout, threatening the old aristocratic and royal dominance. Year by year, the English economy shifted from static land to movable money. A religious cauldron. Religion added fuel to this volatile mix, dividing communities and setting families against each other. Though officially repressed, Catholicism lingered in parts of the kingdom, particularly in the north. The dominant Protestant church faced its own divisions. Anglicans upheld traditional structures and ceremonies, while Puritans sought to strip worship to its moral and spiritual essentials. The Puritans' demands for simplicity and strict morality clashed with the theatricality and grandeur loved by others. Meanwhile, smaller sects, Independents, Quakers, and more, proliferated like wildflowers. One source in 1641 listed 29 sects. By 1646, another counted 180. Radical ideas like skepticism and deism chipped away at established authority, driving cries for tolerance and fierce opposition to it. The Puritans and the theater. The Puritan moral vision sparked battles on every cultural front. Nowhere was this clearer than in their war against the theater. William Prynne's Histriomatics condemned theater as a playground for Satan, a cesspool of blasphemy and obscenity. His fervor led to a brutal punishment, imprisonment for life, a fine of £5,000, and public mutilation with both ears cut off. Poetry in the storm. Even poetry reflected the fractured world. The Cavalier poets, loyal to the king, celebrated fleeting joys amid looming disaster. They sang of love, beauty, and pleasure, their verses tinged with melancholy. Richard Lovelace, imprisoned for his royalist beliefs, wrote, "Stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage. Minds innocent and quiet take that for an hermitage." King versus Parliament. At the heart of England's troubles lay the battle between Charles I and Parliament. Charles, inheriting his father's belief in the divine right of kings, ruled as if he were accountable only to God. Parliament, empowered by the economic and social rise of the bourgeoisie, pushed back. The 1628 Petition of Right sought to curb royal authority, asserting Parliament's rights over taxation and legislation. Charles's refusal to compromise deepened the divide. A lot of Charles' troubles were caused by his advisor, the Duke of Buckingham. The Duke, a childhood friend of his, had encouraged multiple failed conquests and levied heavy taxes on the public. John Felton, a wounded ex-soldier weighed down with debts, angry at the arrears of his pension, and inflamed by pamphlets, bought a butcher's knife, walked 60 miles from London to Portsmouth, plunged the weapon into Buckingham's breast, and yielded himself to the authorities. Buckingham's wife, soon to give birth, collapsed at sight of the corpse. Felton, overcome with remorse, sent her his apologies and begged her forgiveness. She gave it, and so he was given the mercy of execution without torture. With his advisor assassinated, Charles' grip on his kingdom weakened even further. Absolute rule. In 1629, Charles dissolved Parliament, embarking on an 11-year experiment in personal rule. To fund his government, he used extra-legal methods, forced loans, ship money, and old feudal dues. His attempts to impose religious conformity under Archbishop Laud angered Puritans and widened resistance. This period planted the seeds of rebellion as frustrations simmered across the land. The Long Parliament. Charles's troubles came to a head in 1640 when a Scottish rebellion forced him to summon the Long Parliament, dominated by opponents of the king. Parliament quickly dismantled royal power, impeaching advisors and abolishing institutions like the Star Chamber. Civil War and defeat. The First Civil War, 1642 to 1646, split the nation. Royalists backed the king, while parliamentarians sought to limit his authority. The war ravaged England, ending in the king's defeat and his surrender to the Scots in 1646, but victory only deepened divisions within the parliamentarian side. Rise of the radicals. With the king captured, a new struggle emerged between Parliament and the army, led by Oliver Cromwell. Radical factions demanded bold reforms, universal voting rights, religious freedom, and social equality. Cromwell crushed dissent while steering the nation toward a precarious middle ground. The end of a king. Charles's secret plots and continued defiance ignited the Second Civil War in 1648. Cromwell's forces crushed the uprising, and Parliament purged its ranks to ensure control. The Parliament put Charles on trial, convicting him of treason. However, one commissioner told Cromwell they had no legal authority to try a king. Cromwell lost his temper. "I tell you, we will cut off his head with the crown upon it." On January 30th, 1649, the king was executed. The monarchy fell, and England stood at the dawn of a new, uncertain era. At the end, Will Durant asks, was the execution legal? Of course not. Was the execution just? Yes, so far as war is just. Was the execution wise? Probably not. Chapter 9. Alma Mater Italia. Italian culture in the Age of Reason. As we step away from the shadows of England's Great Rebellion, we are drawn to the sunlit beauty and the culture of Italy during the period 1564 to 1648. The paradox of a nation in political and economic decline, yet alive with artistic and spiritual brilliance. Though overshadowed by Spanish dominance, Italy remained the nourishing mother of European culture, giving the world movements of beauty, religious reinvention, and timeless masterpieces. The Magic Boot. Our journey begins with Italy itself, a magic boot, stretching across the Mediterranean, each curve and city teeming with charm. Milan, grand and princely, with countless churches and monasteries alongside a thriving artistic scene. Genoa continued her command over the Mediterranean, her palaces unmatched in opulence across Europe. Florence, though politically subdued, endured as the Athens of Italy, nurturing art, literature, and science. Venice's canals brimmed with life. Bologna's scholarly halls buzzed with innovation. Rome and the popes. At the heart of it all was Rome, a city of faded political might but enduring spiritual grandeur. The Counter-Reformation popes, with the reforms of the Council of Trent, steered the church through Protestant dissent and Islamic expansion. Pius reformed the church with an iron, rallying Europe to victory at Lepanto. Sixtus remade Rome's skyline with architectural projects, tamed lawlessness with ruthless efficiency, and strengthened papal finances. Their leadership breathed new life into Catholicism while reshaping the Eternal City. The Jesuits, warriors of the faith. Emerging as the church's spearhead, the Jesuits infused education, diplomacy, and missionary zeal. Across Europe, their schools molded an educated, conservative elite steeped in Catholic thought. Beyond Europe, they traveled distant lands to spread their faith. In India, they won converts by adopting the customs of Brahmin society. In China, they seduced the Ming court with scientific knowledge, opening doors for Christianity. In South America, the Jesuit communes of Paraguay provided a fleeting vision of harmony, a utopia that was undone by colonial greed. The Italian days and nights. Despite church strictures, pleasure thrived. Bawdy theater, romantic serenades, and extravagant festivals brought joy to the streets. This was the fertile ground from which opera, the ultimate marriage of music and theater, would spring. This was Italy in the Age of Reason, a land of contrasts, a place where decline met renewal. Chapter 10. Grandeur and Decadence of Spain. Spanish life. In the mid-16th century, Spain stood as the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. Her riches poured in from colonies spanning 5 continents, where the Spanish language had become common and Spanish architecture adorned distant cities. Yet, the wealth of silver and gold came at a price, soaring inflation that wages could never match. Despite their empire's grandeur, the Spanish people disdained labor, believing it was better to sleep in a hut, bask in the sun, strum a guitar, and mourn the stinginess of beauty than to work. Religion permeated every aspect of life, from kings who styled themselves more Catholic than the Pope, to bandits who wore religious medallions. Piety ruled supreme. The Spanish Inquisition, relentless in its drive, enforced orthodoxy. Philip II, 1556 to 1598. Philip II, often described as one of the strangest, strongest figures in history, shaped his reign with unyielding Catholic devotion. In his youth, he was a man of gentleness and refinement, but the burdens of leadership hardened him into a tireless ruler. The mysterious death of his son, Don Carlos, and the betrayal of his trusted aide, Antonio Perez, had left deep scars. His mission to preserve Catholicism also had devastating consequences. The persecution and eventual expulsion of the Moriscos weakened Spain's economy, despite its popularity. On the global stage, Philip's ambitions met resistance. The Spanish Armada suffered a humiliating defeat against England, and rebellions in the Netherlands strained resources. Even his victory at Lepanto and his vast empire could not stave off the creeping decline by the end of his reign. Philip III, 1598 to 1621. Philip III, a devout yet ineffectual king, ceded the responsibilities of governance to his favorite, the Duke of Lerma. Lerma, more interested in enriching his family than ruling effectively, did manage to secure peace with England and a truce with the Dutch. However, his most catastrophic act was the expulsion of 400,000 Moriscos. These were forcefully Christianized Muslims. Driven by religious zeal and greed for their property, this act gutted Spain's workforce, leaving an already fragile economy in ruins. By Philip III's death, Spain's decline had deepened, and the once great empire seemed to be unraveling. Philip IV, 1621 to 1665. Philip IV was a king of contrasts, a lover of life's pleasures but burdened by a kingdom in crisis. His reign was influenced by his chief minister, the Count Duke of Olivares, whose vision for reform collided with relentless challenges. Spain's involvement in the 30 Years' War and conflicts in Catalonia, Portugal, and the Netherlands drained the treasury and the will of the people. Rivalry with Cardinal Richelieu of France added further strain, as defeat after defeat eroded Spain's power. By 1643, Olivares had fallen, and Spain, eclipsed by France, was a shadow of its former glory. Portugal, a kingdom reclaimed, 1557 to 1668. Portugal's fortunes were tied to Spain during this era. When King Sebastian's ill-fated invasion of Morocco in 1578 left Portugal without a king, Philip II seized the throne, uniting the Iberian empires. Initially treated with care, Portugal later suffered under Philip's successors, sparking widespread resentment. In 1640, the Portuguese revolted, placing the Duke of Braganza on the throne with support from France, England, and the Dutch. By 1668, Spain formally recognized Portuguese independence, ending nearly 60 years of union. Amidst this turmoil, Portugal celebrated its greatest literary triumph, Luís de Camões' epic poem, The Lusíads. Camões immortalized Portuguese history and spirit, leaving a legacy that endures as a cornerstone of national pride. From unmatched glory to steady decline, this century of Spanish history reveals a nation grappling with faith, power, and the weight of its empire. Chapter 11, The Golden Age of Spanish Literature. From 1560 to 1660, Spain experienced an explosion of artistic energy. This period was fueled by the vast power and wealth Spain amassed through its conquests in the Americas, its dominance in Europe and Asia, and its victories over the Moors and Turks. National pride surged, religious fervor burned brightly, and strict censorship ensured art stayed within the bounds of Catholic orthodoxy. The poets of Spain's golden age, Luis Ponce de Leon, an Augustinian monk, emerged as one of the era's finest lyricists. Despite facing persecution from the Inquisition, his verses expressed Christian piety and linguistic perfection. Louis de Goncourt produced a philosophy of writing called Goncorismo. An excerpt from this writing demonstrates the obsession of the people with pale white skin. Her twin-born sun-bright eyes might turn to summer Norway's wintry skies, and the white wonder of her snowy hand blench with surprise the sun of Ethiopian land. Calderon, the philosopher of drama. Infusing his works with introspection and philosophy, Pedro Calderón de la Barca explored themes of reality, fate, and free will. In his masterpiece Life is a Dream, Prince Segismundo, imprisoned due to a prophecy, experiences a fleeting taste of freedom. What is life? A thing that seems, a mirage that falsely gleams. Phantom joy, delusive rest. Since is life a dream at best, and even dreams themselves are dreams. Chapter 12, The Golden Age of Spanish Art. The Golden Age of Spanish art emerged as a paradoxical time of cultural growth during a period of political and economic decline. Its flourishing was driven by the enduring power of the Spanish Church, the grandeur of the royal court, and the remnants of an empire's former glory. This era saw a blend of sacred and secular artistry, with grand cathedrals standing alongside civic masterpieces like Toledo's Town Hall. The painters of this golden age, El Greco, Zurbarán, Velázquez, and Murillo, defined Spanish art with distinct yet harmonious visions. Together, these artists encapsulated the spirit of an era that, despite Spain's decline on the world stage, achieved eternal glory through its art. Chapter 13, The Duel for France. In the 16th century, France was a nation in deep trouble, riddled with religious strife. A nation struggling to regain its economic footing after decades of war. The royal treasury was depleted, the currency devalued, and the populace increasingly resistant to taxation. Adding to this already unstable environment was the rise of the Protestants. Once a small faction, by 1559 they comprised roughly 10% of the French population. Their rapid growth alarmed the Catholic Church, who saw their considerable wealth threatened by the spread of Protestantism. The powerful Guise family, leading proponents of the Catholic cause, viewed the Protestants not just as a religious threat, but as a political one as well, standing in the way of their ambitions for greater power. Adding to the complex web of conflict were the Bourbons, a powerful noble family with old grievances against the ruling Valois dynasty and the upstart Guises. The Bourbons saw an opportunity in the Protestant cause, a means to challenge the political dominance of their rivals. Catherine de' Medici. Catherine de' Medici was a political operator, a woman forced to play a dangerous game in a world dominated by men. Thrust into a position of power following the death of her husband, Henry II, she had to secure the throne for her young and sickly sons, while contending with the ambitions of powerful nobles and religious factions. Will Durant says, "She is still a puzzle after 4 centuries of conflicting interpretations." She was a master of intrigue, using her Italian heritage of diplomacy and political maneuvering to keep her enemies off balance and maintain a semblance of control. While she was a Catholic, her primary concern was the preservation of the Valois dynasty and the unity of France. To those ends, she played the Catholics and Protestants against each other, seeking peace and stability, going so far as to arrange a marriage between her daughter, Marguerite of Valois, to the Protestant Henry of Navarre. "God willing," Catherine wrote, "I shall not let myself be governed either by one party or the other, having learned only too well that they all love God, the King, and myself less than their profit and the satisfaction of their ambition." Arbitrament of blood, religious tensions, political rivalries, and the machinations of powerful individuals repeatedly boiled over into open warfare. The massacre of Vassy in 1562, a violent clash sparked by a seemingly insignificant dispute between Catholic and Huguenot worshippers, serves as a stark example of the tinderbox atmosphere of the times. The guards drew their swords, the Protestants threw stones. One stone struck the Catholic duke as he left the church and drew blood. His followers dashed into the protesters of 500 men, women and children, killed 23, and wounded 100. This event triggered the first of a series of brutal, religious wars, which dragged on for years, laying waste to the French countryside and leaving thousands dead. Both sides committed atrocities, fueled by religious fervor and a thirst for vengeance. These intermittent wars, punctuated by brief and uneasy periods of peace, illustrate the deep divisions within French society and the failure of attempts at reconciliation. Massacre. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, a horrific episode of planned violence and mob brutality, was triggered by Catherine de' Medici fear of growing Protestant influence at court. Fearing reprisals in a potential Protestant uprising, Catherine persuaded her son, Charles IX, to approve the elimination of key Protestant figures. This decision, born of panic and political illiteracy, unleashed a wave of violence that swept through Paris and into the provinces, leaving thousands of Protestants dead. "Kill them all! Kill them all!" Charles IX infamously declared, a command that was carried out with chilling efficiency. The massacre, initially celebrated by Catholic leaders, ultimately proved a hollow victory, further inflaming religious tensions and radicalizing Protestant intellectuals. This era left a scar on the nation, the memory of which would continue to shape French politics and society for generations to come. Chapter 14. Henry IV. In the treacherous landscape of late 16th century France, Henry IV ascended to the throne through a sea of blood. He emerged as a symbol of unity, a beacon of hope for a nation yearning for peace and stability. Love and marriage. Henry, it seems, was a man who loved life in all its fullness, and this included a passionate embrace of love in all its forms. He was a man of many romantic liaisons, casting aside both mistresses and religious convictions with a nonchalance that would shock the more pious among us. His marriage to Marguerite of Valois, the captivating but notoriously promiscuous sister of Henry III, was a union more political than passionate, plagued by infidelity and mutual distrust, and ultimately dissolved. Henry III, a king ill-suited for tumultuous times. The last of the Valois kings, Henry III, was a tragic figure, a man burdened by physical frailty and emotional instability, wholly unprepared for the challenges of ruling a nation torn apart by religious conflict. He seemed to find solace in frivolous pursuits. He once appeared at a ball in a low-necked dress with a circlet of pearls around his throat. He wore jewels on his ears and bracelets on his arms. His reign was indecisive, miscalculated, and ultimately, his ill-conceived assassination of the Duke of Guise, an act that only served to further destabilize the kingdom, hastened his own demise. A Dominican monk found his way into the royal camp, stabbed the king in the stomach, was killed by the guards, and died in the confidence of paradise. Henry III died on the morrow, August 2, 1589, beseeching his followers to cleave to his cousin of Navarre, Henry IV. The creative king, rebuilding a shattered nation. Once crowned, Henry IV displayed a remarkable capacity for statesmanship, dedicating himself to the task of healing his ravaged kingdom. He appointed the Duke of Sully as his superintendent of finance, charging him with the daunting challenge of restoring order to the state's depleted coffers. Sully, a Protestant himself, attacked corruption and inefficiency and set the stage for a remarkable economic recovery. Henry, ever attuned to the needs of his people, longed, as he said, to see la poule au pot, a chicken in every pot on Sunday. He promoted agriculture, nurtured industry, and initiated ambitious public works projects, earning the enduring affection of his subjects. The satyr, a king of unbridled appetites. Henry's personal life continued to be one of passion and scandal. He was a man seemingly unable to resist the allure of beautiful women, his amorous exploits providing ample fodder for gossip and moral condemnation. His long-standing affair with Gabrielle d'Estrées, who bore him 3 children, and his later infatuation with Henriette d'Entraigues, whom a poet endued with golden hair, starry eyes, lily throat, pearly fingers, and alabaster breasts, kept tongues wagging throughout the kingdom. Even his politically and financially motivated marriage to Marie de' Medici failed to tame his wandering heart. Assassination, a tragic end to a hopeful reign. Just as France seemed poised to enter a new era of prosperity and stability, Henry IV's reign was cut short by the blade of an assassin. François Ravaillac, a religious fanatic convinced that the king posed a dire threat to the Catholic Church, struck Henry down in the streets of Paris. This plunged France into mourning, and while some hailed Ravaillac as a righteous defender of the faith, the vast majority lamented the loss of a beloved king who had brought hope and healing to a nation scarred by decades of conflict. The assassin's limbs were torn from his body by 4 horses, and his trunk was burned in a public square. In his own words, Henry IV was a loyal king, faithful and true, and according to Will Durant, he was the most human and humane of French kings, truly the savior of France. Chapter 15. Richelieu. The death of Henry IV left France with a young and inexperienced king, Louis XIII, and a power vacuum that various factions sought to fill. It was into this volatile scenario that Armand Jean Duplessis de Richelieu, cardinal and later the king's chief minister, emerged as the architect of a new order, one that would transform France into a centralized and powerful state. His life and work, though controversial, were instrumental in shaping the destiny of France and of Europe. Between 2 kings, the assassination of Henry IV left the 8-year-old Louis XIII on the throne, with his mother, Marie de Medicis, as regent. Her rule involved mismanagement and courtly intrigue. This period saw the depletion of the treasury amassed by Henry IV and Sully, as opportunistic courtiers led by Constantino Concini enriched themselves at the expense of the state. Richelieu navigated this turbulent period, ultimately securing the position of Secretary of State through Marie de Medici's patronage. However, his fortunes changed when the young king asserted his authority and had Concini assassinated. Richelieu was made prime minister shortly after. Louis XIII, the melancholic king. Louis XIII, hampered by ill health and a melancholic disposition, lacked the necessary vigor and political acumen to effectively rule France. He was, however, acutely aware of his limitations, and in Richelieu, he found a man possessing the intelligence, the ruthlessness, and the unwavering determination that he himself lacked. Richelieu, describing their dynamic, wrote, "The ability to let himself be served is not among the least qualities of a great king." Though Louis occasionally resisted Richelieu's influence, he ultimately recognized the cardinal's indispensability, granting him the authority to shape the destiny of France. The cardinal and the Protestants. Richelieu understood that a strong, unified France required the neutralization of all internal threats to royal authority. This included the Protestants, whose political and military ambitions threatened to fracture the nation. La Rochelle, their stronghold, had become a state within a state, a safe harbor for pirates and a potential entry point for enemies of France. Richelieu, faced with this challenge, responded with decisive force, laying siege to La Rochelle and constructing a massive mole across the harbor entrance to starve the city into submission. After the fall of La Rochelle in 1628, Richelieu tempered his victory with a surprising degree of leniency. He recognized the economic value of the Protestants to France and, instead of crushing them, sought to integrate them into the fabric of the nation. He confirmed the Edict of Nantes, guaranteeing freedom of worship and access to public office. As he stated, "From that time, differences in religion never prevented me from rendering to the Protestants all sorts of good offices." This policy of inclusion was later reversed by Louis XIV. The cardinal and the nobles. Richelieu recognized that the entrenched feudal system, with its decentralized power structure, culture of private armies, and endemic violence, was incompatible with a strong centralized state. The great nobles, with their fortified castles, private courts, and control over local economies, represented a formidable obstacle to his vision. Richelieu saw France as an unstable and agitated assemblage of proud and semi-independent barons capable at any moment of disrupting the peace and the economy of the state. He moved against them with characteristic ruthlessness, ordering the destruction of all private fortresses, outlawing dueling, and installing royal intendants to oversee the administration of justice and finance in the provinces, thus diminishing the authority of the local nobility. When Gaston of Orleans, the king's brother, and Henri, Duke of Montmorency, rose in rebellion, Richelieu crushed them, executing Montmorency. He justified this action, stating, "Nothing so upholds the laws as the punishment of persons whose rank is as great as their crime." The Cardinal Supreme. With the Protestants and the nobility subdued, Richelieu turned his attention to the larger stage of European politics, where he saw the Habsburg dynasty as the primary obstacle to French security and ambition. He abandoned the appeasement policies of Merrie de Medicis and forged alliances with England, the Dutch, and the Protestant princes of Germany. He skillfully played the complex game of European power politics, manipulating rivalries to France's advantage. Understanding that diplomacy without military force was ineffectual, Richelieu poured resources into building a powerful army and navy. Will Durant writes, he repaired and fortified harbors, established arsenals and provision depots at the ports, built 85 ships, founded pilot schools, trained marine regiments. He intervened decisively in the 30 Years' War, financing the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus to challenge Habsburg power in Germany. When Spanish and Imperial forces threatened Paris in 1636, Richelieu rallied the nation, inspiring the citizens to take up arms and successfully repelling the invaders. He secured Alsace for France, paved the way for the conquest of Roussillon, and by the time of his death in 1642, had broken the Habsburg stranglehold on France, setting the stage for French ascendancy in Europe. Richelieu was a devout Catholic who readily allied with Protestant powers, a champion of absolute monarchy who curtailed the power of the aristocracy, and a man of refined taste and intellectual curiosity. While he was not a man who inspired love, he commanded respect, even fear, for his intellect. He believed that men, certainly states, could not be managed by kindness. They had to be intimidated by severity. He loved France, but Frenchmen left him cold. He was the architect of the French absolute state, laying the foundation for the triumphs of Louis XIV. Chapter 16. France beneath the wars. While Richelieu was busy consolidating royal authority and laying the foundations for the absolutist state, the lives and thoughts of ordinary Frenchmen were shaped by the events of the time. Morals, the religious conflicts that had torn France apart for decades, seemed to be taking their toll on religious belief itself. As people witnessed the horrors inflicted in the name of God, a sense of disillusionment and skepticism began to spread, particularly among the upper classes. This moral ambiguity was further reflected in the sexual mores of the time. While the middle classes, whether Catholic or Protestant, generally adhered to Christian morality, the aristocracy and urban artisans were increasingly caught in a tide of sensuality. Brantôme, a writer of the era, observed that adultery is not so generally punished as in other lands. In a word, it is good to make love in France. Manners. While moral standards may have been in flux, there was a noticeable refinement in manners, influenced largely by the Italian courtly culture introduced by Catherine de Medicis. The French court under Henry III became increasingly ceremonial, with rituals and protocols governing every aspect of courtly life. Henry III created the office of Grand Master of the Ceremonies of France and issued an edict detailing the ritual and protocol of court behavior, specifying everything from how to address the king to who might accompany him on his walks or hunts. Michel de Montaigne. Michel de Montaigne, the Renaissance man, born into a family of wealth and status, he received a humanist education that instilled in him a love of learning and a curiosity about the human condition. His essays offer a humorous exploration of his own, revealing a man grappling with the complexities of faith, morality, and the meaning of life in an age of uncertainty. Education. Montaigne's father, Pierre Echem, had unconventional ideas about education, preferring to raise his son in a rural setting and immerse him in Latin from infancy. Montaigne himself later advocated for an education that went beyond mere book learning, emphasizing the importance of physical and moral development, travel, and the study of history. The philosopher. Montaigne's thought is marked by a deep skepticism, a questioning of received wisdom and absolute truths. He saw the futility of trying to impose one's beliefs on others, famously quipping, "After all, it is setting a high value on our opinions to roast people alive on account of them." The Rolling Stone. Despite his preference for solitude and reflection, Montaigne embarked on an extended tour of Europe, seeking relief from his recurring bladder stones and observing the diverse customs and beliefs of other cultures. His travel diary, discovered long after his death, offers a glimpse into the mind of this restless and inquisitive intellect. Immortals for a Day. Despite the upheaval of the times, the arts and letters flourished in France. Richelieu, recognizing the power of language and culture, actively promoted literary endeavors, founding the French Academy to refine and standardize the French language. This institution, composed of 40 immortals, would play a role in shaping French literary taste and standards for centuries to come. The Academy's purpose was to ensure that the functions of the academicians should be to purify the language from the defilements which it had contracted, and to elevate it to the level of Latin and Greek. Richelieu's patronage also extended to journalism, with the establishment of the Gazette de France, France's first newspaper, albeit one tightly controlled by the state. Chapter 17. The Revolt of the Netherlands. The Dutch Revolt, spanning 8 decades, was a drama played out on a complex stage. The struggle pitted the Dutch, with their merchant class and Protestant population, against the power of the Spanish Habsburgs, determined to uphold Catholicism and hence the Spanish authority. Mise en scène. The Netherlands in the mid-16th century was a land of distinct identity and language, yet united under the Habsburg rule. Economically, it was thriving, with the ports of Antwerp and Amsterdam serving as hubs for trade and finance. Religiously, the seeds of dissent had been sown, with different strains of Protestantism like Lutheranism and Anabaptism making inroads, followed by the more potent force of Calvinism. Charles V's efforts to stem the tide of heresy through the Inquisition and harsh penalties met with growing resistance, setting the stage for the conflict to come. The scene was complicated by the ambitions of the Dutch nobility, who saw in the turmoil an opportunity to challenge royal authority and seize church lands. Margaret of Parma. Philip II, upon inheriting the Netherlands from his father, Charles V, appointed Margaret of Parma, his half-sister, as regent. Though a devout Catholic herself, she was a capable and pragmatic ruler who initially sought a conciliatory approach to the religious tensions. The Beggars, a league of nobles formed in opposition to the Inquisition, presented their demands to Margaret, who was forced to make concessions while secretly pleading with King Philip II for moderation. "Anything and everything is now tolerated in this country," she wrote to Philip, "except the Catholic religion." Alva in the Netherlands. Philip's patience wore thin, and he dispatched the Duke of Alva, a seasoned and ruthless soldier, to crush the rebellion and restore order. Alva's arrival in 1567 marked the beginning of a reign of terror. He established the Council of Blood, a tribunal that dispensed swift and brutal justice, executing thousands of suspected heretics and rebels. He also imposed heavy taxes. While Alva had succeeded in quelling the initial uprisings, his harsh measures only served to solidify the Dutch resolve. His boast that he had executed 18,000 rebels speaks volumes about the brutality of his rule and its unintended consequences. Requesens and Don Juan. Alva's failure to pacify the Netherlands led to his recall, and he was replaced by Requesens, who adopted a more conciliatory approach, but the momentum of rebellion had grown too strong. The emergence of the Beggars of the Sea, privateers who harassed Spanish shipping and controlled key coastal towns, added a new dimension to the conflict. Don Juan of Austria, Philip's half-brother, arrived as governor in 1576, but his romantic ambitions to rescue Merrie, Queen of Scots, and conquer England proved a distraction. Parma and Orange. The death of Don Juan brought to the fore Alessandro Farnese, Duke of Parma, a military strategist. Parma realized that military might alone would not be enough to subdue the Dutch. He needed to divide them. Exploiting the religious divisions between Catholics and Protestants, he negotiated the return of the southern provinces to Spanish control. Meanwhile, William of Orange, the father of his country, faced growing challenges. The Calvinist extremists within his own ranks criticized his willingness to negotiate and tolerate Catholicism. Philip's ban against Orange, offering a reward for his assassination, further endangered the prince's life. "We declare him an enemy of the human race and give his property to all who may seize it," Philip declared. Triumph. Despite numerous setbacks and the constant threat of assassination, William of Orange held firm. He was finally assassinated in 1584, but his legacy lived on. His son, Maurice of Nassau, inherited his leadership, proving to be a brilliant military commander. Maurice modernized the Dutch army, applying scientific principles to warfare, and led a series of successful campaigns that pushed back the Spanish forces. The Dutch control of the seas, their flourishing trade, and their alliance with England further tilted the balance in their favor. The 12-year truce signed in 1609 offered a respite, but internal strife, particularly between the Orthodox Calvinists and the more liberal Protestants, threatened to tear the young republic apart. The execution of Oldenbarnevelt, a staunch advocate for tolerance and the separation of church and state, was a dark stain on the republic's record. Yet the Dutch persevered. When war with Spain resumed in 1621, they continued to resist. The naval victory of Martin Tromp in the Battle of the Downs in 1639 effectively broke Spanish naval power and secured Dutch dominance at sea. Finally, in 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia formally recognized the independence of the United Provinces, bringing to a close the 80 Years' War. It was a triumph born of courage, sacrifice, and an unyielding determination to secure freedom, both political and religious. So triumphantly ended the longest, bravest, and most cruel struggle for freedom in all history. Chapter 18. From Rubens to Rembrandt. Surprisingly, within the small region of the Netherlands, two distinct cultures emerged, the Flemish, rooted in Catholic tradition and the patronage of the court, and the Dutch, shaped by Protestant values and a thriving merchant class. This divergence is reflected in their art, where the canvases of Rubens contrast sharply with the introspective depths of Rembrandt. The Flemings, the southern Netherlands, remaining under Spanish rule, retained its Catholic faith, aristocratic structure, and close ties with France. Despite the ravages of war, Antwerp and Brussels experienced a cultural resurgence under the benign rule of the Archdukes, Albert and Isabel. The people returned to their cathedrals, their festivals, and their love of earthly pleasures. As the Cardinal Infante Ferdinand, son of Philip IV, observed, "Yesterday they held their great festival. A long procession moved out to the countryside with many triumphal cars. After the parade they all went to eat and drink, and in the end they were all drunk, for without that they do not think it a festival." This love of life and a certain indulgence in the senses permeates Flemish art. Flemish art, the court and the church, as well as a wealthy merchant class, provided generous patronage, making Antwerp a leading art center. Tapestries, glassware, and metalwork flourished alongside painting, with a multitude of artists catering to diverse tastes. The Dutch economy. While the Flemings reveled in the patronage of the court and the church, the Dutch, having secured their independence, forged a different path. Their culture was shaped by a growing merchant class, whose maritime ventures and commercial acumen brought them unprecedented wealth. With half the population living in cities by 1623, Dutch ships sailed to the far corners of the globe, establishing trading posts in the East Indies, Japan, and even North America. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, became a global powerhouse, returning handsome profits to its shareholders. This economic success fueled a cultural awakening, with art becoming a cherished possession of not only the wealthy elite, but also the growing middle class. Dutch life and letters. Literacy was high, and the Dutch press was renowned for its freedom of expression. As Descartes observed, there is no country in which freedom is more complete, security greater, crime rarer, the simplicity of ancient manners more perfect than here. Dutch arts. Dutch architecture, unlike the grand structures of Flanders, was largely utilitarian, reflecting the pragmatic spirit of its merchant patrons. Civic buildings, such as the town halls of Leiden and The Hague, showcased a blend of Renaissance and local styles. Hendrik de Keyser, the leading architect and sculptor of his time, left behind the iconic statue of Erasmus. In the minor arts, Delftware, inspired by Chinese porcelain, became a feature in Dutch homes. From the joyous exuberance of Rubens to the introspective depths of Rembrandt, Dutch and Flemish art in this period offer a varied panorama of human experience. These two cultures were ultimately intertwined, both products of a land that had witnessed profound transformations. Chapter 19. The Rise of the North. Denmark as a great power. Denmark, at the outset of this period, commanded a vast and influential territory, spanning from Norway to the distant shores of Iceland and Greenland. Its control of the Sound, the waterway linking the North Sea and the Baltic, provided Denmark with economic and political power. This position, however, rested on shaky ground. The Danish monarchy was constantly contending with a powerful nobility who held sway over half the land and jealously guarded their feudal privileges. Will Durant writes, "Political power resided in the 800 nobles who owned half the land, kept the peasants in serfdom, elected the king, and ruled the country through the Riksdag, or national diet, and the Rigsriad, or council of state." These internal divisions, coupled with a series of costly wars, ultimately led to the decline of Denmark's dominance. Sweden. Sweden's journey to becoming a major European power was a turbulent one, marked by an inevitable interplay of religious and political forces. Erik XIV, a capable but impulsive ruler, found himself embroiled in internal conflicts and wars with Denmark. His successor, John III, briefly flirted with Catholicism, even allowing Jesuits into Sweden, before ultimately reaffirming his commitment to Lutheranism. The ascension of Charles IX solidified Sweden's Protestant identity and paved the way for the reign of his son, Gustavus Adolphus. A military strategist and a skilled administrator, Gustavus Adolphus transformed Sweden into a force to be reckoned with on the European stage. According to Will Durant, he reformed the disordered government, vigorously promoted education, commerce, and industry, and founded the cities of Karlstad, Filipstad, Mariestad, and Göteborg. This last settlement gave Sweden clear access to the North Sea, circumventing Danish control of the straits. His intervention in the 30 Years' War, fueled by both strategic considerations and religious zeal, established Sweden's arrival as a major European power. Poland goes to Canossa. Poland in this era embarked on a unique trajectory, one that led it back into the embrace of the Catholic Church after a period of remarkable religious tolerance. The union of Poland and Lithuania in 1569, skillfully engineered by the last Jagiellon king, Sigismund II, created a vast and powerful realm. However, the elective monarchy that followed Sigismund's death proved to be a source of chronic instability. Every royal election now became an auction of noble votes to the highest bidder among rival candidates, financed usually by foreign powers. This system, riddled with corruption and foreign interference, made it difficult for Poland to maintain a consistent course in its domestic and foreign policies. By the middle of the 17th century, Poland had largely returned to the Catholic fold, its earlier tolerance of fading memory. This shift had profound implications for Poland's future, contributing to its growing cultural and political isolation. Holy Russia. Russia, under the iron rule of Ivan IV the Terrible, had grown into a formidable empire, pushing its boundaries eastward and consolidating its control over its vast and diverse population. Ivan's death in 1584, however, plunged Russia into what is known as the Time of Troubles. During the reign of Ivan's weak son, Fyodor I, the shrewd and ambitious Boris Godunov effectively ruled the realm, eventually ascending to the throne himself. Godunov's tenure faced opposition from pretenders claiming to be the rightful heir, Dmitry, Ivan IV's youngest son, whose death in mysterious circumstances had fueled speculation and discontent. The emergence of the false Dmitry, supported by Polish forces, plunged Russia into a chaotic and bloody civil war. Out of the ashes of this turmoil, the Romanov dynasty rose to power in 1613, bringing some stability to the troubled land. The Romanovs, however, inherited a nation burdened with social and economic challenges, including the growing problem of serfdom, which would continue to plague Russia for centuries to come. From Denmark's fading dominance to Sweden's ascent to greatness, from Poland's return to Catholicism to Russia's tumultuous time of troubles, these nations navigated a period of upheaval. Chapter 20. The Islamic Challenge. While Europe was ablaze with religious conflict, the Islamic world presented a vibrant counterpoint, a world of dazzling art, powerful empires, and a deeply entrenched faith. The Turks, the Ottoman Turks, masters of a vast empire stretching from the walls of Vienna to the sands of Arabia, stood as a force in this age. Their military prowess was renowned, their armies disciplined and well-equipped. Indeed, no matter how far west Islam reached, it remained oriental. Constantinople was a window on Europe, but Ottoman roots stretched too far back into Asia to let proud Turkey ape the West. Their culture, while undeniably influenced by their contact with Europe, retained a distinctly Eastern flavor. The bazaars of Constantinople, the minarets of their mosques, the colors and intricate patterns of their textiles, all spoke to a world apart from the West. Decline of the Sultans. While the Ottoman Empire remained a major power for centuries, the seeds of its decline were sown in the years following their defeat in the Battle of Lepanto in Greece. Successive sultans, perhaps seduced by the luxuries and intrigues of their harems, proved less capable than their predecessors, allowing corruption to fester within the sprawling bureaucracy. The Janissaries, once the backbone of the Ottoman army, grew increasingly unruly, demanding ever greater privileges and resorting to violence to achieve their aims. They invaded the royal palace and compelled Sultana Kusum to open the treasury vaults to appease them. Shah Abbas the Great. While the Ottoman Empire struggled with internal strife, a new power arose in Persia under the dynamic leadership of Shah Abbas the Great. A military strategist and a politician, he united a fragmented Persia and repelled both Turkish and Uzbek incursions, ultimately establishing his rule from the Euphrates River to the Indus. Safavid Persia. Under the Safavid dynasty, and particularly during the reign of Shah Abbas, Persia experienced a golden age of culture and artistry. Isfahan, the Shah's new capital, became a vibrant center of intellectual and artistic life. When Chardin visited Isfahan in 1673, he was astonished to find a great metropolis of administration, commerce, crafts, and arts, with 1,500 villages surrounding it and an urban population of 300,000 souls. The Islamic world of this age, then, presented a multifaceted challenge to the West, a challenge not merely of military might but also of cultural sophistication and deeply held faith. It was a world that, while gradually succumbing, retained its distinctive character and its enduring allure. The interplay between these two worlds, the West and the Islamic East, continues to shape our own time. Chapter 21. Imperial Armageddon. The Holy Roman Empire in the late 16th and early 17th centuries was a patchwork of competing interests and ideologies. Deep fissures ran through the empire, between the authority of the emperor and the autonomy of the princes, between the rising tide of the Counter-Reformation and the entrenched forces of Protestantism, and between traditional social structures and rising economic forces. These tensions, exacerbated by a poisonous climate of religious intolerance, ultimately erupted in the cataclysm of the 30 Years' War, a conflict that would leave Germany devastated and would reshape the political landscape of Europe. The emperors. The Habsburg dynasty, long the symbolic head of the empire, found its authority increasingly challenged during this period. Maximilian II navigated the waters of religious conflict with considerable skill, shielding Protestants from persecution while maintaining a veneer of conformity to Catholicism. However, his successors, Rudolf and Matthias, proved less adept at balancing the competing demands of the empire. Rudolf, a scholar more at home in his laboratory than in the halls of power, allowed religious tensions to fester. Matthias, weary from years of campaigning, ceded power to his ambitious and Catholic cousin, Ferdinand of Styria, who would become Emperor Ferdinand II, a man determined to reassert imperial authority and to champion the Counter-Reformation. The Empire. Beneath the veneer of imperial unity, the Holy Roman Empire was a mosaic of semi-independent states, principalities, duchies, bishoprics, and free cities, each jealously guarding its own laws, customs, and privileges. Each of these units acknowledged no superior except the emperor and ignored him 50 weeks in the year. Economic upheavals added to the political and social fragmentation. The shift in trade routes following the opening of the Atlantic had dealt a blow to the prosperity of German cities, while rampant inflation, fueled by the influx of American silver and the irresponsible debasement of coinage by German princes, sowed discontent among the populace. The peasantry, increasingly burdened by feudal obligations and the erosion of their traditional rights, added to the growing chorus of grievances. Morals and manners. Contemporary moralists painted a grim picture of German society on the eve of the 30 Years' War, lamenting the decline of discipline among youth, the prevalence of gluttony and drunkenness among all classes, and the widespread acceptance of sexual immorality. A jovial prince signed his letters, Valet et inebriamini, be well and get drunk. The hostile creeds, the fragile religious peace established by the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, proved increasingly untenable. The emergence of Calvinism as a major force within German Protestantism further complicated the religious landscape, pitting Lutherans against Calvinists with a ferocity equal to that of their conflict with Catholics. In 1570, 2 men who questioned or limited the divinity of Christ were put to death at the insistence of Calvinist professors in the University of Heidelberg. The 30 Years' War, the defenestration of 2 imperial governors from Richelieu Castle in Prague in 1618, a symbolic act of defiance by Bohemian Protestants against their Catholic Habsburg overlords, served as the catalyst that plunged the already deeply divided empire into a generation of unparalleled bloodshed and devastation. What began as a local rebellion in Bohemia quickly escalated into a pan-European conflict, engulfing Denmark, Sweden, France, and Spain in its storm. The war's course was marked by brutal sieges, horrific massacres, and widespread social and economic collapse. Thousands of fertile acres were left untilled for lack of men, draft animals, or seed, or because peasants had no assurance that they could reap where they had sown. The sack of Magdeburg in 1631, in which victorious troops slaughtered some 20,000 inhabitants and burned the city to the ground. The Peace of Westphalia. After 3 decades of unrelenting warfare, the exhausted combatants finally agreed to a series of treaties signed in the Westphalian cities of Münster and Osnabrück in 1648. These treaties, the product of years of negotiations, redrew the political map of Europe, recognized the independence of Switzerland and the United Provinces, granted significant territorial concessions to France and Sweden, and formally acknowledged the autonomy of the German princes within the empire. While intended to bring an end to the religious conflicts that had ravaged Europe for over a century, the Peace of Westphalia ushered in an era of realpolitik, in which religious zeal was gradually supplanted by the pursuit of national interest and the balance of power. And in the aftermath of this generation of bloodshed and destruction, a growing sense of disillusionment with religious dogma began to spread among the intellectual elite, paving the way for the rise of scientific rationalism and the Enlightenment. Chapter 22, Science in the Age of Galileo. While the shadow of superstition continued to loom large over the popular imagination, the transmission of knowledge through printing and libraries, the invention of crucial scientific instruments, and the work of figures like Kepler and Galileo laid the groundwork for a revolution in our understanding of the universe and ourselves. It is a tale of 2 worlds, one clinging to ancient myths and fears, the other daring to challenge the very foundations of knowledge and to seek answers in the observation of nature. Superstition. Despite the Renaissance and the stirrings of scientific curiosity, superstition remained deeply ingrained in the fabric of European society. The belief in witchcraft reached its peak in this period, leading to a wave of persecution and executions fueled by fear and ignorance. Will Durant writes, "The persecutions were least severe in Spain. In the province of Logroño, the Inquisition convicted 53 persons of witchcraft and put 11 to death in 1610. Otherwise, the accusations were usually dismissed as fanciful or vengeful, and executions for witchcraft were rare." The transmission of knowledge. The printing press, invented in the 15th century, continued to play a role in the dissemination of knowledge. Great publishing houses like the XVIII and the Elseviers churned out a steady stream of books, while new libraries like the Bodleian at Oxford and the Biblioteca Ambrosiana at Milan provided havens for these treasures of learning. The new Vatican Library of Sixtus V in 1588 seemed to Evelyn the most nobly built, furnished, and beautiful of any in the world. The emergence of newspapers, though often unreliable and controlled by the government, broadened the public's access to information, albeit in a distorted form. The tools and methods of science. Crucial to the advancement of science was the development of new instruments. The compound microscope, invented around 1590 by Zacharias Janssen, opened up a whole new world of microscopic life, laying the foundation for modern biology and medicine. The telescope, first demonstrated by Hans Lippershey in 1608 and rapidly improved upon by Galileo, revolutionized astronomy, revealing a cosmos far vaster and more complex than previously imagined. Other instruments like the thermometer and the barometer further enhanced the ability to quantify and analyze natural phenomena. Science and matter. The 17th century witnessed significant strides in the understanding of matter and motion. Descartes laid down quite clearly the law of inertia, that a body persists in its state of rest or in rectilinear motion unless affected by some external force. Chemistry began to emerge from the shadow of alchemy. Science and health. The battle against disease remained a constant struggle, with epidemics of plague, typhus, and other infectious diseases claiming countless lives. In 1604, the bubonic plague was so severe in Frankfurt am Main that there were not enough people to bury the dead. Public sanitation improved gradually, and hospitals expanded their services. Medical education became more rigorous, although the efficacy of treatments remained limited. From Copernicus to Kepler. The Copernican revolution, initiated in the previous century, continued to unfold, challenging the long-held geocentric view of the universe. While the Church remained largely resistant to the heliocentric theory, Tycho Brahe, Johannes Kepler, and Galileo Galilei developed new models of the solar system. Kepler, inheriting Tycho Brahe's observations, formulated his 3 laws of planetary motion, which paved the way for Newton's theory of gravitation. Finally, in 1604, he reached his basic and epochal discovery that the orbit of Mars around the Sun is an ellipse, not a circle as astronomers from Plato to and including Copernicus had supposed, only an elliptical orbit harmonized with the repeated observations of Brahe and others. His work transformed the Copernican system from a speculative hypothesis into a mathematically rigorous model, revealing the universe as a structure governed by precise laws. Galileo, a towering figure in the history of science, made contributions to physics, astronomy, and the methodology of scientific inquiry. His experiments with falling bodies, his studies of motion and mechanics, and his telescopic observations of the heavens challenged long-held Aristotelian doctrines and provided compelling evidence for the Copernican view. Turning it to the sky, he was amazed to discover a new world of stars, 10 times as many as had yet been catalogued. However, his outspoken advocacy of the Copernican theory brought him into conflict with the Church, leading to his trial and condemnation by the Inquisition. Chapter 23, Philosophy Reborn. As Europe grappled with the religious wars and the fragmentation of Christendom, the age of faith was giving way to the age of reason, with the interplay of philosophy and politics, and the groundbreaking work of René Descartes, who laid the foundations for modern philosophy. Skeptics. The seeds of doubt, sown by the Renaissance's rediscovery of classical learning and amplified by the Reformation's principle of private judgment, began to sprout into a full-fledged skepticism that questioned the authority of both the Catholic Church and the Bible. The proliferation of Protestant sects, each claiming exclusive possession of truth, undermined the credibility of religious dogma. The growth of knowledge, particularly in astronomy, geography, and history, further eroded the foundations of religious belief. As Pierre Chiron, a skeptical priest, declared, "All knowledge," he says, "is derived from the senses and is therefore subject to the many mistakes and limitations of the senses. Truth is not for us." Giordano Bruno, a fiery Dominican monk and a passionate advocate for the Copernican system, Bruno boldly envisioned an infinite universe teeming with life and governed by a single, immanent God. His philosophy, a heady mix of Renaissance humanism, Neoplatonism, and scientific speculation, challenged the anthropocentric worldview of traditional Christianity. Bruno's fearless pursuit of truth led him to a tragic end, as his heretical views on the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the nature of the cosmos brought him to the attention of the Inquisition. He was burned at the stake in 1600, a martyr to intellectual freedom. In his own words, Try therefore to be asses, all ye who are men, and you who are already asses, study to proceed from good to better, so that you may arrive at that end in dignity which is attained not by knowledge and effort, however great, but by faith, and which is lost not by ignorance and misdoing, however enormous, but by unbelief. Philosophy and politics. The political landscape of early modern Europe was shaped by the struggle between papal authority and the rising power of nation-states. Juan de Mariana, a Spanish Jesuit, defended the right of the people to depose tyrannical rulers, a position that provoked controversy and led to his condemnation by his own order. A tyrant may be deposed, he may rightly be killed, even in some circumstances by an individual. In contrast, Jean Bodin, a French jurist, advocated for absolute monarchy as the best form of government to ensure stability and order in an age of religious strife. Consequently, absolute monarchy is natural. It continues in the state the power of the father and the patriarchal family. No government is sovereign if it is subject to any laws but those of nature and of God. Hugo Grotius, a Dutch jurist, laid the foundations for modern international law, seeking to establish rules and restraints to mitigate the barbarity of war. I saw prevailing throughout the Christian world a license in making war, of which even barbarous nations would have been ashamed, recourse being had to arms for slight reasons or no reason, and when arms were once taken up, all reverence for divine and human laws was thrown away, as if men were thenceforth authorized to commit all crimes without restraint. René Descartes, a towering figure in the history of philosophy and science, Descartes revolutionized both fields with his method of radical doubt and his emphasis on reason as the foundation of knowledge. He would begin, he said, by rejecting all doctrines and dogmas, putting aside all authorities, especially of Tao Philosophus, the philosopher, Aristotle. He would start with a clean slate and doubt everything, de omnibus dubitandum. His famous dictum, cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, established the subjective consciousness as the bedrock of certainty. Descartes' work, though ultimately seeking to reconcile reason and faith, opened the door to a new era of philosophical inquiry that would challenge the very foundations of religious belief.